Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, for the invitation, and thank you, everyone, for lending me your attention in such an exclusive way. It's one of the sort of, as you get older as an academic, for the graduate students, as you get older as an academic, and I'm starting to inch my way in that direction, saying that I'm older. Hence the reading glasses. When David first met me many years ago, I didn't use reading glasses. It's one of the luxuries of being able to be invited to a workshop rather than having to go to a conference, speaking your paper and hoping that somebody will listen. The possibility of both participating and listening to other people's papers and having a conversation that's this intimate about my own work is really a luxury, and I'm very, very grateful for it. So thank you, everyone who participated in organizing this, but also to Stephen for the invitation. What I want to do today, I have a written paper which I will try to read from. What you have on the screen, something that I don't usually do because I tend not to project text, but in this case I wanted to because some of the things that I'm working on tend to be somewhat, I'll be referring to a few of those points, but they tend to be somewhat verbose in their formulations, and I apologize for that. The paper is written for an audience that I don't know, well, hopefully it exists since you're here, but I'll tell you what I'm trying to do with the paper. It's part of a larger project that's trying to make sense of some of the things, actually exactly the things that the sensorial revolution that David talked about, especially with regards to the turn towards affect studies in the 1990s and subsequent to that and to this day. It is very much, in my part of the world, which is political theory and political science, it is very much involved with a whole series of questions that have to do with the relationship between mind and body and the privileging, especially in the post-Enlightenment period, in the modern period, of the privileging of epistemology as a mode of inquiry and a mode of investigation. So theory of knowledge as a mode of inquiry and a mode of investigation for getting at moral problems in politics, right? So that a moral problem is something that may or may not be solvable by appealing to epistemological claims. And of course, the sort of central figure of this is Kant. What I'm trying to sort of get at, and it's because this project is related to another project that I'm also working on that has to do with, of all things, algorithms. But what I'm trying to get at is to make a case that the turn to the senses is actually, and the whole sort of sensorial turn is actually, in part, a project that is interested in rethinking the nature and status of criticism, and specifically political criticism. Literary criticism, but also political criticism. What do I mean by this? Because so much of our accounts, especially in the 20th century, for obvious reasons that we all know, so much of our accounts of political criticism, cultural criticism, literary criticism, and what various people who have sort of brought this return this into investigation that have variously called the hermeneutics of suspicion or ideology critique, is invested in the epistemic, is invested in the idea that you can change people's beliefs by changing people's minds. And we have very little, I'm not an empirical political scientist at all, but we have very little evidence that suggests that you can change people's beliefs by changing people's minds. What we do have is very good evidence that sensorial practices shape our dispositions and orient us to the world differently. And so the project that this is hopefully going to be part of is a way of trying to think about how the turn to the senses is actually a kind of return to the empiricist revolution of the 18th century. Before that moment was definitively understood and articulated and then challenged by Kant. That is, not as an epistemic problem, but a problem of thinking about the relationship between experience, world intimacy, and the moral sentiments. And so that's the sort of general framework. And from there, I'm trying to get an account of empiricist criticism that is neither epistemic nor obviously rationalist. And the way that I want to do that is by tracing the tradition of moral sentimentalism and empiricism in a variety of strains, what I refer to as a minoritarian strain of political empiricism, in a variety of strains. The figures that I'll talk about the most, or I'll mention the most today, are going to be Hume, James, Bergson, and Deleuze. But I'm thinking about it more capaciously than that. And what I am actually going to sort of talk about is how a couple of key points that are mostly going to be point number 1 and number 2 from that morphology that I find them sharing, that there are family resemblances between these thinkers and throughout the period, the modern period, the really long modern period, that makes it so that we can start to identify a tradition of thought that offers a mode of criticism that isn't purely epistemic and that isn't purely dialectic. Okay, that's the big project. Within the subdiscipline of the discipline of political science and the subfield of political theory, there's a little bit of a bracket that you should know about. For those of you who don't know about, political theorists have typically gone along very, very poorly with empiricists. For maybe the reasons that even David sort of highlighted too. He was talking about psychology, and presumably I think you were referencing behavioral psychology. The behaviorist turn in the post-war period was a very significant project that developed, especially in the social sciences, but especially political science, that pushed political science towards quantitative analysis and away from political theory and history. The way that it did that was by taking on the idea that had been prevalent amongst behaviorist circles, taking on the idea that normative and ethical, what today we would consider political and what prior to that were considered political, orientations were not adequate to the study of politics. So the provocation here is that what's happened there, and the reason why in political theory we've missed the sensorial turn in empiricism, is because we think of empiricism exclusively in empirical behaviorist terms. And that part of the critique is going to say, well, they missed the boat on that, on what was actually happening there as well. So basically what I'm trying to do is present a defense of 18th century moral sentimentalism as a mode of critical analysis. For those of you who come from the world of English, one of my undisclosed advisors when I was a PhD student was Francis Ferguson. So you might get, that's where much of this is coming from. So I'm putting all my cards on the table. All right. The reception of post-war French philosophy in the Anglo-American world proved challenging. It was at once embraced and refuted vehemently. The writings of many French thinkers were immediately recognized by Anglo-American readers as philosophically suspicious, and just as quickly judged and given labels, whether feminism as existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, whatever you like. Now, this readerly response points to a commitment to sense-making through classification. Trained in analytic reading strategies, Anglo-American scholars of political theory and philosophy in the post-war period were thrown off by what seemed like unapproachable stylistics that were incompatible with those of an Anglo-American readerly eye. This because for a French-speaking audience, the qualifications of coherence and clarity, which was one of the main sorts of attacks, but also skepticism and relativism, stood as the expectations of a political rationality that was part and parcel of a religious and political system of rule. This is in post-war France. Coherence and clarity were the principal virtues of French classicism, that structured the aesthetic and political virtues of a bourgeois ancien régime, which immediately after World War II had become a defender of and participant in the colonial wars in Algeria and Indochina. In short, while America was in the throes of McCarthyism and the logical analysis of propositional truths in language, and there's some very interesting work done by a philosopher named John Macomber, very, very smart Hegelian philosopher. 2 books, in particular, Time in the Ditch and The Philosophy Scare, which details in a both sociological, empirical, but also heavily philosophical way of how it is that the analytic turn and the positivist turn in philosophical departments in the United States was a direct response in favor of McCarthyism and the elimination of political theory, because political analysis was immediately considered Marxist. Anything that had to do, and this also helps explain the moves in the political science departments. In fact, the institution that I come from, UCLA, I discovered this reading one of his books, had an explicit policy called the California Doctrine or something like that, that was about eliminating political philosophers and Marxist thinkers from the faculty. And it did so very successfully and indirectly. So the point being that there's a politics to precisely the mode of thinking that tries to be apolitical. So my ambition today is going to offer a morphology of this minoritarian tradition of critical political theory I've named political empiricism. More than an interesting cluster of concepts and ideas, political empiricism emerges as an innovative alternative to extant forms of political theory and criticism in France in the post-war period, especially as these are associated with those cadre of thinkers that in the United States and England and in the Anglo-speaking world would eventually be labeled as post-structural or postmodern. Specifically, these thinkers enacted a recovery and adaptation of some elements of empiricism and moral sentimentalism, and the two were inseparable for them, in the way in which the historian Jessica Rifkin talks about sentimental empiricism in her first book. On the predominance, to account for difference as radical pluralism. And this was the sort of push, right? This was the definition of difference, the philosophy of difference in terms of radical pluralism. And this is why the body, as a sort of empiricist understanding of the body, starts to become really, really important to them. So having focused almost exclusively on the predominance of Marx, Freud, and especially Nietzsche's influence on these post-war thinkers, and their relationship to Marxism and the French Communist Party, the innovative deployment of sensationist and moral sentimental philosophies for these thinkers has gone almost entirely unremarked. As is well documented, the history of modern political criticism is firmly grounded in Immanuel Kant's critical project. To those who Kant's moral writings that define critique in terms of an epistemic analysis that holds the power of political emancipation. Jerry Schneewind, the philosopher Jerry Schneewind, explains that knowledge involved in Kantian morality is autonomy, as autonomy is knowledge of the self's own way of thinking. For Kant, he says, a moral world will result, if at all, from the guidance their inner constitution gives the agents who are its members. It's a familiar story. And that inner constitution is the faculty of reason. This account of theory and criticism is decidedly not the case for the tradition that I'm pointing to. This tradition has its roots in modern empiricism. Empiricism is not immediately associated with critique in the modern sense of political criticism or critical theory, hence my calling it a minor current of thought. I'm going to skip that part because this part about logical positivism, because I just described it. But what I do want to say is that I'm not going to focus on empiricism as a theory of knowledge. And this is one of the interesting things that's developed from the 18th century to the present, especially in the post-war period, is that empiricism is read exclusively after Kant, which is to say, as a problem of skepticism. Thankfully, people in literature departments have understood 18th century moral sentimentalism in relationship to empiricism in very interesting ways. But this hasn't really translated into the sort of philosophical discussion and even the political science discussion of what empiricism is. And this is what I'm trying to draw from, is this conjunction that, like, empiricist philosophers were also moral sentimental thinkers. And it's really important that they were. For the empiricist, experience is sensation that confirms a relation between life and world, and not the production of data or information. The political importance of this for the purposes of this paper is twofold. First, the empiricist commitment to relationality shifts our critical attentions away from investigation into the validity of claims, propositions, beliefs, and arguments, and towards a focus on the dispositional modalities that generate sensorial arrangements. And this came out in David's talk as well about relations themselves, about the relationship between sensation and relations. And the second thing is that the empiricist commitment to relationality articulates political critique as a practice committed to transforming human social and cultural sensibilities rather than as an effort to change other minds. In short, the political thrust of empiricism is to emphasize how associative arrangements are never settled because relations are processes in formation. So allow me to elaborate. I read the sensationist and sentimentalist dimensions of empiricism as a set of observations about the effectivity of dispositional modal powers in everyday life. Sensation, in other words, are not powers of a political, sensation, in other words, our sensations are the powers of a political physics that generate forms of intimacy amongst and between other worlds, other peoples, and other times. These dispositional powers are tendential, which means that they are neither necessary nor contingent, but somewhere in between. As the philosophers Rani Anjum and Stephen Mumford account for them, dispositions only tend to, and this is a quote, only tend towards their manifestations. They do not necessitate them. Sensations, perceptions, and sentiments aren't merely feelings that a subject registers. They are dispositional powers that tend bodies towards other bodies. The moral sentiments are dispositional powers that emerge from sensorial experience to arrange bodies, to bring them together, or to rest them apart. How much time do I have, by the way?
Till 2:30. I mean, we're...
Oh, till 2:30.
Well, we want to have time to talk.
Yeah, no. How much time before question time?
Well, as
Okay.
we said, 30,
Somebody shut me up at
35
some
minutes. No, please go ahead.
The moral, at its core then, empiricist criticism is associationist in that it looks to the interstitial dynamics of relations, and it is political in its emphasis on the powers and forms of coordination or discordance that transform singularities into pluralities. Finally, what distinguishes the political theory of political empiricism from other accounts of social and political association is that it does not rely on a transcendental theory of consciousness, on a specific account of human will or intention, nor on the powers of cause and necessity to explain or legitimate processes and structures of association. Another way of stating this that mattered to the post-war French context I'm thinking about is that the emphasis on sensation in political empiricism absolves the need for an epistemology of meaning to account for motivation. And this is where things get really sort of start to get both interesting and ugly at the same time, or can be. As is evident in my rehearsal, the principal philosophical insight of empiricism, crucial for the account of political criticism I offer throughout, is that relations are not determined by the terms that they relate. Relations are independent of their objects. This is why dialectical criticism falls apart for empiricism, and it's also why the whole critique of substance is really, really important to it. The critique of the schools, and especially of Aristotelian substances. The political stakes of empiricist criticism, therefore, is to engage and transform the associative dynamics that coordinate relations in a social system, and to intervene in the in-between of dispositionality. In short, the moral sentiments offer a political theory of relations that refuses the idea of necessary relations, including, and this is crucial, I think, the necessary relation of contradiction or negation for political critique. So the authors I'm going to look at are Hume, Bergson, James, and Deleuze. And the appendix up there is supposed to guide us, but it probably won't, also because the text is so small. So I'll do my best. Okay, so the first part of the essay is about the sensationist critique of substances, and the second part of the paper is about the sensationist physics of collective formation. What does it mean to say that empiricism begins from experience? At a very crude and basic level, it means that empiricism does not begin from a conception of human essence, identity, or substance. David Hume was explicit and unrelenting about this, going so far as dismissing the Eleatic challenge as that unintelligible chimera of substance that he describes as nothing but a collection of simple ideas that are united in the by the imagination. Hume's dismissal is indicative of a basic refrain of empiricist political criticism, and this is point 1 on their rejection of Aristotelian substances. Any identity is in fact not a unity, but an assembly of moving parts and relations. More to the point, that assembly is an artifice of the powers of the imagination that animate the mind to associate experiences, and they do so automatically, right? This is not a mind that has a will or an intention. The imagination is, it's a difference machine for somebody like Hume. It just associates things in a manner in which we cannot explain when they happen. To begin from experience thus means that no account of the human or of an object or of sense can be given independent of one's immediate relationship to it. Experience means relation, not brute data. Data may be drawn from experience, but so can other things like affects, dispositions, and perceptions. Whatever the case, the sensorial relation needs to happen before anything may be drawn from it. It is temporally antecedent to understanding, reflection, and meaning. And its happening speaks to an intimacy between life and world. That power of intimacy is empiricism's first radical challenge. That nothing precedes experience means that there is no method, critical or otherwise, that transcends the immanence of the relational event. And this, I'm using a vocabulary that is coming from the thinkers that I'm interested in, but I'm also trying to sort of situate it beyond that immediate context, or it has to do with the way in which this post-1950s French moment is going to be reading these pragmatists and these empiricist thinkers. This is what William James affirms in the essay entitled A World of Pure Experience, when he says that this is a quote, knowledge of sensible reality thus comes to life inside the tissue of experience, end quote. And then proceeds to discuss the tissue of experience as, and I'm quoting again, a coming into existence. Experience, in other words, is the name given to life itself, understood in terms of the vitality of sensation. Nothing can precede this, which also means that nothing transcends the immediacy of the tissue of experience that, as he further affirms, is made, and quoting again, is made and made by the relations that unroll themselves in time, end quote. In these phrasings, James creates a sequence of conceptual relations that coordinate a central empiricist insight that nothing precedes life itself. However simple and basic this insight may seem, it has radical consequences, especially for the French context that I'm thinking about, because at its core, the observation implies a rejection of any transcendental account of existence, whether soul, spirit, sense, data, consciousness, or history. Indeed, what James's formulation makes clear is that the idea of substance is troubling because a substance is not a thing but a process of coming to existence. To speak of substances, or of the idea of substance, presupposes a halting of the coming to momentum that generates the possibility of a thing's existence. So for the empiricist, nothing is self-identical because there is no stable substances, stable in the sense of being able to affirm a final coming to existence that would allow us to confirm a self-same identity through time. Hence James's penchant for discussing one's field of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. Bergson, echoing James, speaks of existence as a continuous flux. For him, existence can't be identified with a specific condition. Indeed, it is no condition at all. It's the flow of succession that he calls duration. Duration is multiplicity and encroachment, what he calls encroachment. Bergson's duration implies a suspension of that way of thinking that imagines ideas, concepts, and physical entities as unities. Consider in this respect the idea of dialectical criticism, which both James and Bergson are suspicious of. That begins with the idea of a contradiction that emerges from the negation of two ideas. In this relation of negation, the empiricist would see a commitment, if not an outright defense, of a natural contrariety. A natural contrary has a specific form and content. It is a conceptual unity. And the possibility of dialectics rests on the idea that a contrariety is a unit of contradiction and that identity and negation exist as substances. Bergson's metaphysics of duration and his sensationist disposition more generally doesn't allow for such an account of critique, because his sensationism pluralizes the dialectical relationship between unity and multiplicity itself. And it does so by removing negation as the necessary power of critique, whether historical or conceptual. Duration is the metaphysical experience that Bergson introduces so as to wrest our thinking from the idea that there is a transcendental relation of critique. This would be the point number 8 that I outlined. So experience for Bergson is encroachment, and encroachment is a disposition of motive sensation. More specifically, vitality's movement is not reducible to the relation of contradiction as negation. Simply put, Bergson's articulation of duration challenges the dialectician's reliance on the discreteness of substances. While I was experiencing them, he affirms, they are solidly organized, so profoundly animated with a common life, that I could not have said where any of them finished or when another commenced. In reality, no one of them begins or ends, but will extend into each other. Together, James and Bergson put pressure on the idea of the substantiality of discreteness, especially as this regards the edges of borders, frames, and contours of experience. James does this by suggesting that any substance is in fact conceived, or better conceived, as a field of relations. And Bergson expresses this in his commitment to pluralize unities by showing the work of duration as a perpetual force of extension and distension. By attending to sensation, then, we acknowledge the lived relationality of worldliness, and this sentimental empiricist attunement to lived relationality goes all the way down to the idea of consciousness itself, that James will define as an association, as Hume had done. Consciousness connotes a kind of external relation and does not denote a special stuff or a way of being. The peculiarity of our experiences that they not only are but are known, which their conscious quality is invoked to explain, is better explained by their relations to one another. So let me belabor the point, because I find James's substitution and idea here of relations to be particularly significant. What he does is substitute our tendency to think about things as substances and substitutes the word relation for substances, so that no thing is a substance, everything is a relation. This is a metaphysical substitution that warrants altering our critical and political dispositions. It's, in short, that element of sensationism that will emphasize how all substances are actually composites. And such composites are disjunctive because a relational juncture is one of discordant accord. For the empiricist, there is no such thing as a transcendental or natural relation, and thus there can be no transcendental concept of criticism. The stakes of this are notable, not just for contemporary theories of criticism, but for the study of politics and political theory. Yes, there's the element of skepticism, and yes, there's the attention to experience as such, but more radically still, a political theory of political empiricism offers us a way to think concepts as encroaching contiguities, and this invites a mode of practical criticism as an exploration of the relations that generate intimacies with the world. A task of empiricist political criticism, then, is to engross oneself with the dispositional powers of disjunctive intimacies, their modes of association, and the possibility of their rearrangement. Dialectical critique may be part of that, but it is certainly not the only relational form of criticism. This because the metaphysical reduction of multiplicities to contrarieties in dialectics is not available to the empiricist, who admits that relations are at once external, extensive, and dispositional. The next and final part of the paper I'm titling Empiricist Individuation. As Hume famously noted, the self is a farrago, and as Deleuze reprised, the eye of subjectivity is a habit of repetition. In short, empiricism is not a philosophy of individualism, possessive or otherwise. It's a metaphysics of sensation. Its metaphysics of sensation won't allow for it. Empiricism is a philosophy of elemental differences coming to existence. Hence the term individuation that I'm using, which refers to, and not just me, that refers to processes of coming to formation. Here is James's famous articulation at this point. Empiricism lays the explanatory stress upon the part, the element, and treats the whole as a collection and the universal as an abstraction. My description of things accordingly starts with the parts and makes of the whole a being of the second order. It is essentially a mosaic philosophy, a philosophy of plural facts, like that of Hume and his descendants, who refer these facts neither to substances in which they inhere, nor to an absolute mind that creates them as its object. As we've seen, the idea of consciousness as a stable substance that carries with it a specific set of capacities across peoples and worlds is put under duress by the tradition of empiricist political criticism. More to the point, what's put under duress is the idea that there's a willing or desiring subject antecedent to experience. James is explicit about this. Relations that connect experiences must themselves be experienced relations, and any kind of relation experience must be accounted as real as anything else in the system. That is to say, anything that seems substantial must account for the fact that it is comprised of a set of relations. Many of the orientations that comprise the minoritarian tradition of empiricist political theory that I'm talking about share a refusal to rest or to conclude or to arrive at some finality. This is, in part, quite an explicit refusal, at least in the 19th century, and in the context of Bergson and James, but not just them. I think Whitehead as well, a whole bunch of people, a refusal or a rejection of Hegel and Hegel's idealism, and not just Kant. Hence the importance for many empiricists of dynamics like constancy, habit, customs, which are terms that describe movements of repetition, of contiguity, of reintegration. Considered in this respect Hume's treatment of constancy in the treatise, the first thing that you note is that constancy, or the opinion of continued existence as he calls it, is for Hume customary. And more importantly, it is customary of the operations of the imagination. And what he means by this is that the constancy and continuity are felt relations in the imagination whose task it is to assemble the concatenation of impressions received from our sensorial lives. This means that for Hume, our lived experience are successive, they are serial, but their succession does not imply a sequence. Hence the importance of the imagination for the empiricist that describes a mental faculty of composition, where relations of constancy and continuity are forged so as to give a sense of a sequence of what the classicist scholar James Porter refers to as stoicheia. In short, the imagination is the faculty that assembles ideas from impressions. And this brings us to the matter of the empiricist imagination, which once again cannot be a substance or a thing, but is a collection of powers and forces. This is Hume's insight that compels Kant to have to define the imagination as a non-legislative faculty. He can't do otherwise in the third critique. It is neither muse nor fancy, it is not, and it does not possess will or intention. It can't, because that would amount to attributing an identity with a specific power to the imagination, which we have seen is not possible for the empiricist. In other words, the empiricist imagination is very different from the romantic account of the imagination. That the notion of identity is artifice in the imagination suggests that for the empiricist, the imagination is an automaton of relationality, at once impersonal and impartial. And that word impartial, I don't mean in the sense of distance, but without having specific parts. Hence a central incommensurability between empiricists and rational theories of criticism. The rational position gives priority to the understanding, and thus privileges contradiction, in most cases, as the site of political contest. The need to uncover or resolve contradiction is normative and lexically prior to all other critical aspirations. This, as we've discussed, is posited as producing a greater amount of freedom and autonomy. The critical production of meaning, in other words, is a political practice of freedom from domination. And meaning is produced by exposing and correcting contradictions. This is as true of neo-Kantian tradition of critique as it is of the neo-Hegelian and neo-Marxist tradition of ideology critique. This can't be the case for empiricism, because the dismantling of the metaphysical concept of identity. This initial Humean conceit is followed by the subsequent proposition that there are no substantive relations. The practice of criticism can't rely exclusively on contradiction as the necessary relation for criticism. If our lived world is one of succession and duration, then the notion of identity, or what Hume calls the notion of identity, upon which the critical operation may be founded, must be pluralized. Empiricist criticism doesn't accept the identitarian model of either Kantian or Hegelian dialectics. Instead, empiricist criticism addresses itself to the dispositional powers of the coming to existence of formations. So now some conclusions. Do I want to go through these conclusions? Yes. A political theory of empiricist criticism introduces us to a minoritarian tradition of sensation critique that finds expression in the works and writings of some thinkers in the post-war period in France. And as I noted, and I'm happy to talk about how I see that in the Q&A. As I noted in my prefatory comments, the dimensions, influence, and stakes of this tradition of thought have gone principally unremarked. And for the purposes of further exploring the political and methodological stakes of this critical tradition, I'm going to summarize some of the more labile premises that I think are involved. First and foremost is the matter of priority empiricism gives to associations over substances. This is the political insight that has been set aside by some late 19th century and 20th century appropriations of empiricism, and it is the insight that Bergson, James Deleuze, and others attempt to recuperate. Logical positivism and the subsequent behavioral social sciences claim empiricism as their own because their methodological ambitions are to determine observable truths and to do so in a systematic way that produces concrete and indisputable facts. Now, I'm not interested in contesting the value of such a project. I actually do think it's valuable, nor do I wish to contest its normative or prescription ambitions. What I do contest is the faithfulness of such an account of empiricism to the formulations and insights offered by the moral sentimental thinkers that I'm talking about, to the implicit assumption by many proponents of behaviorism that empiricism is not a political philosophy. The limit of this approach lies in reducing experience to observable evidence, and I think that that's obviously too reductive of an account. Empiricism, in other words, is a political theory of mind-body entanglement for me, and not mind-body dualism. The empiricist does not believe that existence is either mental or corporeal. It is mental and corporeal. In Hume's famous and slippery account of personal identity and the impossibility thereof, he insists that selfhood is at best a perception, and that any claim of identity of self is observational and sensorial. This mind-body entanglement puts front and center empiricism well-documented materialist ambitions, and hence the emphasis it will give to sensation, aesthetics, and perception. We find this empiricist commitment in Deleuze's equally famous account of the body without organs, first articulated in Empiricism and Subjectivity and then reprised throughout his collaborations with Félix Guattari. The body without organs thesis is Deleuze's way of formulating the empiricist position that there is no form of organization that pre-exists one's lived experiences. A body without organs is a sensing body whose organization is a perpetual coming to existence. Hence the importance of the moral sentiments also to political empiricism, and that belief that moral life is rooted in bodily sensation. So much has been made of empiricism, materialist theories of knowledge, that what is often overshadowed is how truly radical this insight is for our theories of politics. To ground moral life in sensation means that there is no transcendental authority that dictates the nature of action. This is the core of political empiricism's radical pluralism. No order, political, aesthetic, moral, or otherwise, precedes experience. This associationist insight affirms that any order is always in process. The political work of empiricism, then, is not to establish incontrovertible facts or truths upon which political society should be based, but in participating in activities of organizational transformation. This is what it means to live a life of sensation, which is at once a political life. For empiricism, political life regards the active participation in diverse dispositional powers that organize and transform collective arrangements. If the above is an account of the political life of sensation, it's also an account of a certain kind of empiricist political criticism that isn't dialectic, for three main reasons. One, because of empiricism's commitments to the artifice of personhood and the non-teleology of process, and two, because of political empiricism denies the existence of transcendental relations. This means that critique is not exclusively dialectic and thus not exclusively oriented to resolving contradictions, whether in the form of self-contradictions, like in Plato and Kant, historical contradictions, like in Hegel, Marx, and Adorno, suspicious interpretations, as in the case of Freud, Gadamer, and Ricoeur, or performative contradictions, as in the case of Habermas. And 3, for political empiricism, there is no transcendental theory of meaning or concept of the understanding. For all these reasons, political empiricism is anti-authoritarian and radically pluralist. Having said this, how political empiricism is articulated and expressed in the modes of political thinking of some of those post-war French thinkers I mentioned in my prefatory remarks is going to remain for another time or for our discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not really an expert on this topic and this period, but let me just, I always find problematic to read their empiricism and the first point, a critique of Aristotle.
Right.
Because Aristotle was also an empiricist.
No, and it's not, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, I mean,
Yeah,
one
that's
way
important.
to go about it is that to say that what characterizes empiricism in this sense is that it is anti-essentialist, right?
Yeah, sure.
So, and then it goes a follow-up. The question is, how do you think that these authors in this political empiricism think about rights, natural rights, human rights, and so on? I mean, because you don't have any essences, you don't have any sort
No,
of
they don't.
nature. So, how can you argue for a theory of rights?
You don't.
You cannot.
You cannot. You cannot argue for a theory of rights. I mean, this was basically, and I don't work on Bentham, but, this is why Bentham talked about human rights as nonsense upon stilts, right? There is never a moment in which human rights are actually anything other than articulating a set of relations between who does and who does not have access to political participation.
But relations in the sense that they are just, linguistic,
No, they're
or
not
some sort of construction, but not
Right.
founded upon like nothing.
No, I mean, and this is, this was this is why Hobbes says ultimately that you got to make it up, right? That the system of rights is an artifice, and we'll call that artifice the Great Leviathan, right? And I have no problem of sort of saying that, because otherwise, if that were the case, we discovered human rights in the 18th century, and it wasn't until the late 19th century that we stopped slavery, right? It doesn't seem to me that knowing that even if human rights exist, that knowing their existence is going to prevent us from continuing in a set of practices that systematically excludes a segment of the biodome, never mind the population, from having access to those rights, never mind voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. The simple fact that people, to me, the history of the acquisition of rights for specific groups is evidence of the inexistence of natural human rights, right? It is the existence of constantly having to re-articulate the relationship of a set of disposition, practices, bodies to a set of institutional and jurisprudential privileges.
Can I just ask about the nature?
Yeah.
Can I just ask about the nature of those dispositions? Because those dispositions, I mean, there can't be a sort of essentialist claim to those dispositions.
No.
So
I don't mean to suggest that the language of dispositions to refer to specific relations. This is why I like the kind of work that some analytic philosophers have been doing around dispositional modalities, right? Because it's very, very good at describing, and this interstitial domain, not purely contingent and not purely necessary either. It's a tending towards, right? Which is exactly what the moral sentimentalists understood as the moral sentiments, especially something like sympathy, right? What is sympathy if not a disposition towards others? And in Hume's case, right, I think quite rightly, a disposition towards those things and those people and those experiences that are more proximate to us rather than far away. The really big sort of challenge of sympathy is why should we care about somebody who's on the other part of the world, right? And this is why we develop a discourse of human rights to try to persuade us that we should care. but clearly we're not very good at being persuaded by it. Or at least there's bad evidence to suggest that we were. There's good evidence to suggest that we weren't persuaded by it. But to get to your Aristotelian point, you're right. This is not, I mean, you know, we're talking about two historically specific forms of Aristotle, right? One is, you know, the schools, the scholastic Aristotle that, you know, that the 17th and 18th century was rejecting. Certainly Hume was. And then in the French context, it is, you know, that I'm really interested in. It's the classicist era, you know, the same type of Aristotle, which is to say, the theory of representation, the theory of mimesis, as being the structure and foundation for knowledge, right? So that we have, you know, the emergence of Nouvelle Vague cinema that completely undoes narrative cinema, right, with the jump cut, amongst other things. You have the Nouveau Roman that has no narrative structure whatsoever, right? All of these attacks on the poetics are starting to emerge in the post-war period. And in part, you know, this is directly linked to the, you know, to the response and rejection of the French state that wants to insist that a Republican education rooted in French classicism, basically, which is rooted in Aristotelian, the Aristotelian structure of the unity of I'm blanking on it, is necessary in order to retain the, you know, the political conditions of the French Empire. After Vichy, in the middle of Indochina, in the middle of Algeria, it's just like people were just not sold on this anymore. Absolutely not. It's just like, you know, don't come and talk to me about progressive history, and so Hegel's out, and don't come and talk to me about, you know, essential substances. And also because within the French context especially, you know, where was the place where the idea of essences and substances was preached? It was the Catholic Church, right? In the French context, it seems to me that like Aristotle was never divorced from Catholicism, and Catholicism, you know, always sided with the aristocracy and with institutionalized power. Right, so the pushback isn't to the great Aristotle, because it is Aristotle who theorizes dispositional modalities anyway, but it is to the figure of Aristotle as it's being received in the period and being articulated indirectly, because there aren't even actual appeals to Aristotle, but there is, you know, it's Aristotle all the way down. Yeah.
So when I listen to Davide talk, I am always inspired and my mind hurts. It really, really hurts because it's the big picture, and I can only access it in patches. But let me just give some of the patches that connect it up. I too have read that wonderful book called Science in the Age of Sensibility by Jessica Riskin. And you know, we normally think of the 18th century as the age of reason, but actually it was also the age of sensibility.
Yeah,
and I think that unfortunately that rationalist understanding continues to dominate. But this whole idea of sentimental empiricists is actually, you know, what was being formulated during that time. Now, what on earth is a sentimental empiricist? Okay, it's actually a really interesting play on the word feeling, in that feeling both refers to a sensation, a physical sensation, and an emotion. Okay? And so, you know, the empiricists of the day are feelingful. Now, we don't think of it, we think of empiricists as hard-nosed, okay, a hard-nosed empiricist account. That's because of the influence of behaviorism and so forth. These were sentimental empiricists. They were feelingful. One of the manifestations of that is this idea of disposition that you were talking about. Now, I'm grasping at straws, okay, in terms of contextualizing what you're saying in the few things that I know. But in the 18th century, what's interesting is that amongst these people that you're talking about, you know, like Smith as well, okay, there are all these senses that get invented. Okay, so forget the five senses, or yes, but there's also the moral sense. Okay, a moral sense. Now, you know, and we still have that word. Okay, but do we understand what it means? I mean, that it's a feelingful morality. There is the public sense, there is the aesthetic sense, there is a whole profusion of senses which are treated as if they were the physical senses that we know, because of this disposition that you're talking about, okay? That a disposition to empathize, which is what the public sense is about, or the aesthetic sense, feeling beauty and so forth. So it's a question of dispositions and not substances. And it's a question of relations and not substances. And the most powerful example of that is Hume, who you wonder about, like, his only idea of thinking is the association of ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are no essential ideas, nothing. You just combine things. So you're like this sort of oscillating, assemblage. And Hume, he wasn't a person, he was an assemblage.
Right.
Is
And
in
Hume-
a way, what
Hume's way of, I mean, I have an affinity for Hume, so I love talking about Hume. But in Hume's way to get around the problem of self and substance is to develop the idea of character, right? Character is that we present, right? That for him is doing the work of some form of substance. So when you can ask a human and say, like, but there is a self, it's like, no, there's character, right? It's a set of practice, it's a set of relations, it's a set of all those sorts of things that present who you are in the world, right? Not before the world or inside of yourself. So I mean, it's a really sort of, but you use the language of assemblage. I want to sort of pick up on that because this project started when I started some time ago, but it started. I was spurred on to sort of think more about these sorts of things when I read an essay. I can't remember the author's name, and I feel bad about that. It was a short essay in Theory, Culture, and Society that was almost like a dictionary entry on the word assemblage. And there's where I learned, I paid attention to. I knew this intuitively, but I didn't know it. That the French word that gets used for assemblage and assemblage theory that comes from the sort of Deleuzean tradition that I'm coming from as well, obviously, is agencement. Right? The French word is agencement, which means to connect. Assemblage gives the idea of something that's a conglomerate. It already sort of satisfies our sense of a unity, right? But agencement, which is the actual French word that is translated in assemblage, is connection, right? It's this emphasis on connectivity, and it became the word that the people who were highly dissatisfied with the Marxist, French Marxist Party, that were on the left, but were highly dissatisfied with the French Marxist Party because, what's happening in 1950 and 1960 is that the French Marxist Party is having to deal with Stalinism. And that becomes a huge problem for French Marxism. It becomes the word that these people pick up on, and why the emphasis of relation, because they need a new way of thinking about social solidarity and political solidarity. And it can't be class-based, and it can't be coming from that tradition of dialectics that assumes, a certain kind of class composition and overcoming and all that sort of stuff. All of that stuff is just being undermined by this critical tradition. And so agencement, assemblage, and the emphasis on moral sentiments and political empiricism is the place. There's actually also more concrete reasons why this is the case, like why Hume and pragmatism in France in this period. There's a very famous philosopher who's teaching all of these guys. His name is Jean Wall, and he was the person who introduced American and pragmatism and French and English empiricism to France in the 30s, and then he had to come to the United States for a while because he was Jewish, and then he went back. So there is an actual intellectual connection. Yeah.
So that's where your word concatenation comes from, because it's an interesting word. It's used actually in moral theology to describe the interconnection of the vices
And the virtues. And the virtues.
He doesn't know about
Yeah,
virtues.
yeah.
He only knows about vices. You should.
I hear that there are some things called
Yeah.
virtues. But, but seriously, the earliest moral theology is a theology of vice, not of
course.
evil, not of good, in Catholic tradition. So the way you can go way you can talk about a sequence, a movement from one to the other, the enchainment.
Mhm.
That's what
Concatenation
that's
means.
what the catenatio means.
Right.
Is that not an assemblage, but just one after the next.
But but it is this idea of focusing on how the one and the next are able to coexist, right? And this is to me what's really sort of what is very different from the Aristotelian tradition, right? Of necessary relations. That became so important to the idea of necessary relations. That was the sort of seed of justifying and legitimizing political authority in the early modern period, right? So think of the great chain of being, think of the right of inheritance, that kind of stuff, right? I mean, for me, this tradition of thought is the one that sort of says, hey, it's possible to have a family without a natural child, or with an adoptive child. Right? You don't need to have to be the genetic father or genetic mother of the child in order to father or mother a child. And that to me is a really sort of, at least within the sort of confines of how we understand, even how we understand Plato, sort of Aristotle's account of politics, right? That very sort of heterosexual account of politics that begins with man and woman creates child, and then they create a village, and then it takes a village to create a nation, and all that sort of stuff.
And then you work up to the great chain of being.
And then you work up to the great chain of being.
Yeah, but then I think that's why the modality, I think it's interesting that you brought that, because then you don't have a universal necessity,
Yeah.
but you have, once you have a certain structure created, or a certain sequence,
Mhm.
or a certain family relation, then it becomes necessary in that case.
How?
I mean, if that's the way that you define family, then it's necessary the way that you define family. So there isn't like an essence that you can ground that necessity, but for the individual case, there is a structure, there is a character, or there is a sequence. You establish that relation, and that relation is established for that case necessarily.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. For that case, for that in
Because
that.
otherwise there is no explanation. for
Right, but
why
it's-
it is
it's-
this
it's-
rather than that.
Sure, but it remains imminent to that case and not extendable beyond that case,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the other completely different. We need to stop, but sorry, I'll stop here.
Okay.
But I was just going to say Wittgenstein.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.